The auctioneer called it a vessel. Every other being in that docking bay called it a coffin. I called it mine. The moment the gavel came down, 6 different alien species turned to look at me, not with curiosity, with the specific kind of pity you give someone who has just stepped off a ledge and hasn't realized it yet. The Volkai Harbor Master Sauce, a 6-limbed creature who communicated grief through paperwork, immediately pulled out a data slate and began typing. I would later learn he was filing what his species called a condolence of poor judgment, on my behalf, without asking. I thanked him for it. I meant it. The ship sat at the far end of Bay 14 like something that had given up on existing, but hadn't quite gotten around to finishing the process. The hull was the color of rust if rust had somehow gotten worse. 3 of the landing struts were bent at angles that suggested the ship had landed hard, argued with the ground, and lost. One of the cargo doors was welded shut with material I didn't recognize. The navigation array on the top side had more cracks in it than a dried riverbed. Every credit I owned had just transferred to a seller who left before the transaction finished processing. He had practically run. I stood in front of the ship and did not feel afraid. I felt something else, something I hadn't felt in 7 months. I felt like I had a problem I could actually solve. My name is Mara Voss. I'm 17 years old, born in a place called Caldwell, Ohio, which is a town so flat and so quiet that leaving it felt less like a choice and more like something the geography demanded of you eventually. My father was a mechanic, not the glamorous kind, the kind who fixed things other people had given up on. Old tractors, broken generators, salvaged engines that other shops wouldn't touch. He had a saying he repeated so often it stopped being words and became background noise. If something was built, it can be understood. If it can be understood, it can be fixed. His tools were in my bag. I walked up the entry ramp. It groaned under my weight like it was offended. I walked through the airlock corridor, which smelled like burnt circuitry and something that might have once been oxygen, and I stopped in the center of what passed for the bridge. The consoles were dark. 3 of them were cracked entirely. The pilot's seat had been replaced at some point with a chair that clearly came from a different ship and had been bolted to the floor at a slightly wrong angle, so sitting in it meant leaning 4 degrees to the left permanently. The view screen flickered once when I touched the panel beside it, showed a single line of text in a script I didn't recognize, and went dark again. I sat down in the crooked chair. I looked at the dead consoles, the cracked screens, the wiring hanging loose from the ceiling like the ship had started to come apart from the inside and then stopped halfway through. I looked at all of it. Then I opened my bag and took out my father's wrench. It took me 4 hours to find the primary power fault. It was buried under 2 layers of plating that had been welded over so many times, the original material was barely visible beneath the repairs. Someone had patched this ship repeatedly. Multiple species, multiple techniques, multiple eras of technology stacked on top of each other like a geological record of every time this ship had nearly died and been pulled back. The welds were different colors. The patch materials didn't match. It was, by any engineering standard, a disaster. I thought it was beautiful. Here is what alien engineers see when they look at a ship like this. A machine past its tolerance. A system that has exceeded the acceptable number of repairs. A vessel whose structural integrity score has dropped below the threshold that makes continued operation rational. Here is what I saw, a sequence. Every repair told me something. Every patch was a conversation between whoever made it and whatever had broken. When you learn to read machines the way my father taught me, you stop seeing chaos and start seeing logic. Even bad logic. Even logic that shouldn't work. It's still logic. Follow it back far enough and you find the root, and when you find the root, you find the fix. The primary power fault was a cascading relay failure that had been incorrectly patched 6 times. Each patch had addressed the symptom instead of the cause, so each one had eventually failed and been patched again, deeper into the system. The original fault was small, laughably small. A single degraded coupling in the tertiary power distribution line that every previous engineer had somehow missed because they were always too focused on the failures downstream of it. I replaced it. It took 40 minutes and 2 tools from my father's bag. The ship's lights came on. Not all of them, but enough. Sas appeared at the bottom of the entry ramp almost immediately, as if he had been watching the bay with the specific vigilance of someone who expected a small catastrophe and was not going to miss it when it arrived. He looked up at the lights. He looked at me standing in the airlock. He looked back at his data slate. He started a second grief document, then he stopped. He stared at the lights for a long moment. He put the slate away. I went back inside and found the engine compartment. The main drive was a Keth series propulsion unit that had not been manufactured in at least 60 years. Finding parts for it in the current market would have been nearly impossible. This concerned me for approximately 4 seconds, until I opened the casing and found that someone, at some point in this ship's long and troubled life, had modified the drive with components from at least 3 other engine types. The modifications were chaotic. They were also, if I followed the logic of them, more interesting than the original design. I sat down on the floor of the engine compartment with my father's toolkit spread out beside me, and I started taking notes. Not on a data pad, on paper. I still used paper. It was a habit my father had insisted on and one I had never broken, because he said that writing with your hand forced your brain to slow down enough to actually understand what it was seeing. He was right about most things like that. I wrote for 2 hours. The engine compartment was cold and the ship smelled wrong and the floor was harder than I would have liked. None of that mattered. The sequence was there. The logic was there, buried under decades of wrong fixes and panicked patches, but it was there and I could read it. I did not sleep that night. By morning, I had a list of 17 specific repairs in the correct order. Not the order that seemed intuitive. Not the order any standard repair manual would suggest. The order the ship's own modification history was pointing toward, as if every previous engineer had accidentally left breadcrumbs leading to a solution they'd been too conventional to find. I sat in the crooked pilot's chair as the docking bay outside began to fill with the noise of early morning traffic. Ships coming and going. Beings of 40 different species starting their day. The ship was quiet around me. I put my hand on the dead navigation console and felt the faint vibration of the newly restored power running through the wall panels. The ship was breathing again. Barely. One engine. The lights on reserve power, but breathing. I said quietly to no one, "Okay, let's figure you out." The ship did not respond. It was a machine, not a person. But the lights stayed on. That felt like enough. I reached into my bag, past my father's tools, and found a pen. On the first page of my notebook, above all my technical notes, I wrote 2 words. The deliberate mistake. That was her name. Every ship deserved a name. This one deserved a name that was honest about what it was and stubborn about existing anyway. I had 200 credits left to my name, a 17-point repair list, a ship that most of the galaxy had written off as dead, and no plan beyond the first step. I picked up the wrench. I got to work. The first week I slept 3 hours a night, not because I was pushing myself, because every time I lay down, my brain kept running calculations, kept chasing the next thread in the sequence, and sleep felt like putting a bookmark in a sentence before it finished. So I'd lie there for an hour, give up, and go back to the engine compartment with a flashlight and my notebook. Rook found me on day 9. He appeared at the bottom of the entry ramp just after dawn, all 4 of his arms pressed close to his body, which I would later understand was his species' equivalent of trying to look smaller than they were. Thavik are insected, about my height, with 4 arms and 6 eyes arranged in a half circle across their face. Rook's eyes were a pale amber color. All 6 of them were aimed at me, with the expression of someone reading a contract they weren't sure they should sign. He said his name was Rook. He said he needed crew work. He said he was a qualified navigator, engineer's assistant, and cargo manifest processor. He said he had references. He did not mention why he needed work so badly that he was standing at the ramp of a ship that was visibly held together by ambition and stubbornness, asking a human teenager for a job. I didn't ask. His reasons were his. I said I couldn't pay him yet. He said that was acceptable. I said the ship wasn't flight ready yet. He said he was aware. I said the living quarters had no functional heating. He said Thavik ran warm, which was, I would discover, not entirely true, but he said it with such conviction that I let it go. He came aboard. I put him to work on the navigation core, which I hadn't touched yet because it was running on a script I couldn't read. I told him this. He looked at the navigation console for a long time. Then he looked at me. "This is Vreth script," he said. "Is that bad?" The Vreth have been gone for 400 years. "So it's old, can you read it?" He was quiet for a moment. "No." I looked at the console. Then I went and found everything I could access on Vreth script through the station's public data network. There was not much. The Vreth were a civilization that had vanished completely enough that most databases had them filed under historical footnotes. But there were fragments, linguistic analysis papers, a partial Vreth-to-Galactic Standard Dictionary in an academic archive that looked like it hadn't been accessed in 30 years. I downloaded all of it. I started reading. Rook watched me do this with an expression I was beginning to identify as his default reaction to things I did. A silence that was not quite disbelief and not quite acceptance, but somewhere in the middle, like a calculation that hadn't resolved yet. "You're teaching yourself a dead language," he said. "I'm learning how to read the navigation system." "That is the same thing. Only technically." He made a sound that I would eventually recognize as a Thavik sigh. He went back to work. The weeks stacked up. I fell into a rhythm that had nothing gentle about it and everything necessary. Mornings I spent on the physical repairs, working through my 17-point list. Afternoons I spent on the Vreth language, sitting at the navigation console with my handwritten notes spread around me, cross-referencing the academic dictionary with what I was seeing on the screen, building my vocabulary one symbol at a time. Evenings I traded repair work at neighboring bays, fixing other ships, other people's problems, earning parts and credits and occasionally food. The alien mechanics in the neighboring bays got quiet around me in a way I noticed, but didn't comment on. There is a threshold in alien engineering culture. Every species that builds things has a version of it. They call it by different names, but the concept is the same, the accepted ceiling. The point at which a system has been pushed as far as its design allows, and to go further is considered irrational. Engineering schools teach it. Design manuals enforce it. It's the ceiling every engineer respects because it's the ceiling every machine was built for. No one had told me about the ceiling. Or rather, I'd grown up around a man who, when he hit a limit someone else had decided on, would look at it for a moment, then look at the problem and say, "That's their limit. What's the machine's actual limit?" So I had absorbed, without meaning to, a way of thinking about machines that didn't include automatic respect for other people's ceilings. I wasn't being reckless. I want to be clear about that. Every modification I made to the deliberate mistake I tested. I modeled. I ran through the logic 3 times and then asked Rook to check my math. I wasn't guessing. I was asking the ship what it wanted to be, reading the modifications that had been layered into it over decades, and following the logic to a conclusion that the original designers hadn't intended, but that the machine's actual physical properties allowed. The ship was built for a top speed of about 60% light standard. That was the design ceiling. When I finished the engine work on day 31, I told Rook we were going to do a test run inside the station's open range. He asked what speed we'd be testing at. I said we'd see. He tightened all 6 of his eyes, which meant he was bracing himself. The deliberate mistake hit 94% light standard on the first run. Rook said nothing for a very long time. He was gripping the co-pilot's console with 2 of his 4 arms and using the other 2 to hold his data recorder, which he had apparently been using to document the test, and which now showed a speed readout he was staring at like it had said something personally offensive to him. "The design ceiling for this engine class," he said carefully, "is 60%. "The design ceiling," I said. "Right. We just did 94. The ship has been modified 12 times over 60 years by 8 different engineering traditions. The design ceiling stopped being relevant about 30 modifications ago. I calculated the actual structural tolerance of the current configuration. It's higher." He looked at his recorder, he looked at me, he looked out the view screen at the stars. He started a new entry in his log. I had learned by this point that Rook logged everything. It was a Thavic cultural habit, documenting events as they happened, which he had explained to me as something between record-keeping and processing. His logs were private and I never read them, but I knew he was keeping them, and I knew this moment had just gone in. We came back to the dock. Sas was waiting on the bay floor, which I'd stopped being surprised by. He had developed a habit of appearing whenever something significant happened with my ship, as if the harbor master's office had given him special notification powers, or he had simply developed an instinct for it. He looked at the ship. He looked at the speed data on his own dock monitoring system. He did not reach for his data slate. He stood very still for a moment. Then he said, in the careful way he spoke Galactic Standard, "That was not supposed to be possible." "Most of what's worth doing isn't," I said. He looked at me. His 6 limbs shifted in a pattern I had learned meant he was recalibrating his understanding of something. He went back inside without filing anything. That was the first time that happened. It would not be the last. The sealed cargo hold I found on day 38. I had been doing a structural survey of the lower deck, checking the hull plates for stress points after the high-speed test run, and I found a section of wall that my survey scanner said was solid hull material. But the wall was warm. Not hot, not alarming, just 2 degrees warmer than every other wall section on the lower deck, steady and consistent, as if something behind it had been generating a tiny, constant amount of heat for a very long time. I knocked on it. The sound it made was not the sound of solid hull material. I ran 3 different scans from 3 different angles. Each one told me the same thing, nothing there. Solid wall, no compartment. I stood in front of that wall for a long time. Then I went and got Rook. He ran his own scans. He got the same results. He put his hand on the wall and held it there for a moment. 2 degrees warmer, he said. Every scan says nothing's there. He took his hand off the wall. He looked at me. I would like to note formally that I am uncomfortable with this. Noted. I would also like to note that I know you are not going to leave it alone. Also noted. I ran my hand along the edges of the wall section. There was no seam visible, no handle, no access panel, but there was a faint ridge near the bottom left corner, so subtle I would have missed it with anything less than direct touch. A ridge in the shape of a symbol. Vreth script. I went and got my notebook. The Vreth symbol on the wall meant, as best as I could translate it, something between waiting and not yet. I wrote it down in my notebook and stared at it for a long time. Then I left it alone, because some things announce themselves in their own time and forcing them early tends to go badly. We took our first cargo run 3 days later. The job came through a mid-tier freight broker on the station called a hauler's board, which was exactly what it sounded like, a board where cargo owners posted jobs and ship captains picked them up. Most of the jobs were low pay, short hop runs nobody else wanted. I took 2 of them, both heading to stations in the outer edge of Sector 9, and I told Rook we were leaving at dawn. He was ready an hour early. His gear was stowed, his navigation calculations were done, and he was sitting at his console running system checks when I came onto the bridge. This was, I would discover, simply how Rook operated. He treated preparedness the way other people treated breathing. We left the dock without ceremony. Sauce watched us go from the bay floor. He did not file anything. He just watched. That had become his way of marking moments he didn't have a document category for. The first run went smoothly. The cargo was machine components, packed tight, no fragile handling requirements. The deliberate mistake handled like a different ship than the one I'd bought. She was responsive in ways that still surprised me, quick in a manner that didn't match her size or her history, as if she had been waiting a long time to move properly and was making up for lost time. Rook updated his log at least 4 times during the flight. I didn't ask what he was writing. The second run was where things got complicated. We were 3 hours out from the delivery station when the Dreth patrol intercepted us. Dreth are tall, gray-skinned, and deeply committed to the idea that authority is most effective when expressed through documentation. They travel in pairs always. They speak in precise, structured sentences, and they file reports the way other beings breathe, constantly, automatically, without interruption. A Dreth patrol stop is not a quick event. It is an experience. Their ship came alongside ours, and their lead officer, who introduced himself as Inspector Vethnock Harold of the Sector 9 Transit Authority, informed me in careful galactic standard that the deliberate mistake was being flagged for a compliance inspection. I invited them aboard. They came on with scanning equipment and data slates, and the specific energy of beings who had found 47 violations before they'd finished walking through the door, which, to be clear, they had. Inspector Vethnock Harold read them out one by one with the calm pleasure of someone who was very good at their job and knew it. Thruster modification exceeding certified output parameters. Navigation system running on unregistered legacy software. Cargo door seal using non-standard bonding material. Hull plating on sections 7 through 11 showing non-regulation repair methods. Engine configuration deviating from manufacturer specifications by a margin that Vethnock Harold described as, quote, significant and frankly unprecedented. And so on. Rook sat very still at his console, with the posture of someone trying to take up less space than they actually occupied. When Vethnock Harold finished, he looked at me across the bridge with the expression of someone holding a very long form and a pen. I said, "Can I explain a few of these?" He said that was not standard procedure. I said, "Violation 12, the navigation software. VrethScript navigation systems predate Sector 9 Transit Authority jurisdiction by 400 years, which means they fall outside the regulatory framework your code was written for. They're not non-registered. They're pre-registration. That's a different category." Vethnock Harold's pen stopped moving. I kept going. Violation 23, the thruster output. The certified output parameters you're referencing apply to the original Keth series engine specification. This engine has been modified to a configuration that no longer matches any existing certification class, which means there's no applicable certified output parameter to exceed. The violation you've written refers to a specification that technically doesn't govern this engine anymore. He was very still now. I went through 11 of the 47 violations. Not all of them, because some of them were fair and I knew it. But 11 of them had the same structural problem. They were written against standards that didn't apply to this ship in its current form because this ship had evolved beyond the categories those standards were built for. Every point I made, I backed with either technical specification data or direct reference to the regulatory code's own scope definitions. Rook had stopped pretending not to listen. He was watching the inspector with all 6 eyes. Vethnok Harold stood on my bridge for a long moment after I finished. His data slate was in his hand. The 36 remaining violations were all technically valid, and I knew it. He knew I knew it. He filed a compliance notice for those 36, issued a standard correction window of 60 standard days, and left. He walked off the ship very carefully, the way people walk when they're thinking hard about something and their body is running on autopilot. His partner followed him without a word. We heard their ship undock and pull away. Rook let out a breath he had apparently been holding since the inspection began. You argued Dreth regulatory code at a Dreth inspector. I read the code last week, after I saw there might be a patrol route through this sector. He looked at me. You anticipated this. I anticipated something. You prep for the category, not the specific event. He opened his log and started typing. 3 days later, we found the colony ship. It showed up on long-range sensors as a contact with irregular drift, which is never a good sign. A ship with good engines doesn't drift irregularly. A ship in trouble does. We pulled alongside. She was a Marath colony transport, a long, wide-bodied ship built for carrying families across sector distances, and she was in serious trouble. Her outer hull had stress fractures across the primary section. Her navigation lights were dark. Her transponder was sending a distress signal on a frequency so old that Rook had to pull up a legacy protocol table to confirm it. I hailed her. The response came back weak and fractured but clear enough to understand. Life support was at 4%, 83 passengers. Power failure in the main generation core 3 days prior. They had been drifting since. 4% life support. I looked at Rook. Options. Nearest authorized rescue vessel is 6 hours out, minimum. That is assuming they respond to our relay immediately. 4% life support would not hold 83 beings for 6 hours. I looked at the deliberate mistakes power distribution schematic on my console. I had that schematic memorized the way other people memorized song lyrics. Every node, every relay, every pathway. I said, I can reroute our power grid directly into their life support system. Use us as an external generator. Rook was quiet for a moment. That would require docking at a non-standard coupling point. Our ship was not built for external power transfer. No, but their ship has a standard emergency coupling on the port side. If I dock close enough, I can bridge our secondary power grid to it through an external relay line. It's not a designed function, but the power pathway is there. You would be essentially running our ship's power through their hull. Yes. Our own ship would be running on primary power only during that period. Yes. And if our primary power system has any instability, it won't. I fixed it. He looked at me. He looked at the colony ship on the view screen. He looked back at me. I would like to note formally that this is an unusual approach. Noted, prep the relay line. The docking approach was the hardest flying I had done in my life. The colony ship was drifting with an irregular rotation, which meant I couldn't just match speed and come alongside. I had to calculate her rotation rate, position the deliberate mistake ahead of her drift path, and let her come to me in a controlled way while I matched her motion in real time. Rook called out drift angles. I flew. The ship groaned twice in ways I did not enjoy. We made contact, hard enough to rattle every loose thing on the bridge, not hard enough to damage either hull. I held position with the lateral thrusters while Rook got the airlock coupling locked. The relay line connection took 22 minutes. My hands were steady. I made them be steady. When I threw the transfer switch, our ship dimmed. Every non-essential system went dark. The bridge lost half its lighting. The temperature started dropping slowly. On the colony ship, the lights came on. I sat in the dimmed bridge with my jacket pulled around me and watched the power readout on the relay connection hold steady. Rook said quietly, "It's working." We held that connection for 4 hours and 31 minutes until the rescue vessel arrived and took over with proper equipment. In that time, the bridge of the deliberate mistake got cold enough that my breath was visible. Rook ran warm, he had told me. He was shivering after hour 2. He didn't say a word about it. When we finally disconnected and restored our own power grid, the colony ship's captain came on comms. Her name was Asa. She was old, her voice low and calm in the way of someone who had been through enough that calm was a permanent setting rather than a mood. She thanked me in Marath first, then Galactic Standard. She asked what law I operated under. I thought about it. Currently none that I know of. There was a pause, then she laughed. It was a real laugh, not polite, not brief. She laughed the way people laugh at something that is also completely true. She said, "I will remember you, Mara Voss." The channel closed. Rook updated his log. I went below to check the relay connections and make sure nothing had stressed during the transfer, and when I came back up, I found myself standing at the door to the lower deck, looking at the warm wall. 2 degrees, still steady, still there. Still waiting. I went to the engine room and got back to work, but I was thinking about that wall. I was thinking about the symbol carved into it and what it meant. Not yet. The galaxy, I was beginning to understand, was full of things that had been waiting a very long time. The question was what they were waiting for. The coordinates from the Vreth log sat in my navigation system for 11 days before I admitted to myself I had already made the decision. I hadn't opened the sealed hold yet. The Vreth symbol had yielded to me eventually, the way all locked things yield when you understand the language they were built in. The door had opened with a sound like pressure releasing after a very long time, a slow exhale, and inside I had found rows of data cores stacked from floor to ceiling. Thousands of them, each one stamped with Vreth military registry marks. Rook and I had spent 3 days pulling the logs. The translation was slow. My Vreth script was functional but not fast, and there were technical and military terms that didn't appear in the academic dictionary I'd learned from, but we worked through it. The Vreth had been a civilization of engineers, explorers, and builders. They had reached farther than most species of their era, pushed their technology harder, mapped deeper into the outer sectors. And then, approximately 412 years ago, they had found something. The logs were not panicked. That was the part that stayed with me. Military logs from the end of a civilization's existence, and they were precise and detailed and carefully recorded. Whoever had written them had understood exactly what was happening to their species and had chosen to document it anyway, with the specific stubbornness of people who believed the record mattered even when no one was left to read it. They had found a structure in a dead star system, ancient beyond their ability to date. It had offered them something. They had almost taken it. The last surviving Vreth captain had put these logs in a decommissioned cargo ship, filed the coordinates in the sealed hold, added a single line of instruction, and then there were no more logs. The instruction said, "Do not go where we went." Then the coordinates. The same coordinates already loaded into my navigation system. Rook had asked if I was going. I had said I hadn't decided. That was 11 days ago. I set the course at 400 station time, when the dock was quiet and no one was watching. The deliberate mistake lifted clean and smooth and fast, and I let her run at full speed through the outer edge of Sector 9 and into the deep nothing of the unmapped border. It took 18 hours to reach the dead system. I knew it was the right place before the sensors confirmed it. The star was burned out, a cold dwarf at the system's center putting out barely enough light to see by. The planets, what was left of them, were rubble, not in the natural distribution of an old planetary system. In a pattern. The debris fields were too regular, too organized. Whatever had happened to these planets had happened deliberately, and whatever did it had done it carefully. And at the center of the inner debris field, visible on the long-range sensors as a solid contact in the middle of all that organized destruction, was the structure. Rook said nothing for a long time. I held course. It was enormous. That was the first thing. Larger than any constructed thing I had ever seen, larger than the stations I had docked at, larger than anything in the Vreth logs had suggested, as if the words they'd chosen to describe it had been deliberately understated, as if they had not wanted to write down the actual scale because writing it down would have made it too real. It was dark, not unlit but genuinely dark, a material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, so that it appeared as a solid black shape against the star-scattered background of space, present and enormous and completely, silently still. I brought the deliberate mistake in slow. The structure did not react until we were within 1,000 meters. Then a single panel in its surface opened, smooth and precise, and light came through it. Not an attack, not a weapon, an invitation. I looked at Rook. He had all 4 arms braced against his console, all 6 eyes forward. His jaw was set with the specific expression I'd learned meant he was afraid and had decided to continue anyway. "I need to go aboard," I said. "I know. You should stay with the ship." "I know that also." I left him on the bridge with the engine running and the emergency undock sequence already loaded into the navigation panel. If I hadn't come back in 4 hours, he would leave. Those were the instructions. He didn't like them, he followed them. I crossed to the structure through the open panel, in a suit with 6 hours of air. The interior was lit by the same light as the panel, sourceless and even with no shadows anywhere. The corridor I walked through was tall and straight, and the walls were covered in symbols. Not Vreth script, not any script I recognized, but the arrangement of them, the spacing and the logic of their layout reminded me of the data core symbols from the Vreth logs. They had borrowed from this place, or this place had given them something. The corridor opened into a chamber at its center. In the chamber was something that occupied no physical space in any way I could identify, but was absolutely and completely present. Not a creature, not a machine in any sense I had words for. A system, an intelligence constructed out of something older than any civilization that had ever tried to name it. It registered my presence the moment I stepped into the chamber, and it showed me this fact by displaying data. My data: species classification, population count, technological tier rating, expansion rate, average decision-making patterns. The full record was precise and detailed and had been assembled from something, some means of data collection I couldn't identify, and it covered the entire period of human civilization with the calm, organizational thoroughness of something that had been watching for a very long time. Below the species data, a single column of text appeared in galactic standard, simple, clear. An offer. Technology beyond anything our species had developed. Resources. Protection from the conflicts and threats of the wider galaxy. A guaranteed future, secured and stable and long. Every previous civilization had been offered this, the logs had said. Every previous civilization had accepted. And then it had filed them. Not destroyed them, not conquered them, something more final than either of those things. It had taken everything they were and cataloged it, organized it, removed the uncertainty from their existence, and in doing so had removed everything that made their existence theirs. Civilizations that had taken this deal were still technically alive, somewhere in the system's records, but they had stopped growing, stopped changing, stopped being unpredictable in any of the ways that made civilizations matter. The Vreth had read the terms and run. They had not run fast enough. The text waited. I stood in the center of that chamber with 6 hours of air in my suit and the greatest offer in human history in front of me, and I thought about my father. Not a memory, not a scene, just the weight of his tools in my bag back on the ship, the specific weight of them, worn smooth from his hands and then from mine. The wrench he had used for 15 years on every broken, unlovable, given-up-on machine that had ever come through his shop. He would have looked at this offer the way he looked at any deal that seemed too complete. He had a saying for those two. He said, "Anything that solves every problem at once is selling you a problem you don't have yet." I looked at the offer in front of me. Then I looked at the structure around me. And I did what I had been doing since I was 12 years old. Standing next to my father in a freezing shop on the edge of a flat Ohio town, I stopped looking at what the thing was built for, and I started looking at how it was built. The system was enormous and old and more complex than anything I had encountered, but it was built on a logic. Everything built on a logic can be read. Everything that can be read can be understood. Everything that can be understood. I opened my notebook. 6 hours later, I walked back across the gap to the deliberate mistake. My hands were shaking. I noticed that the way you notice weather. The structure behind me was dark, not destroyed, not gone, functioning exactly as it had functioned before except for one thing. I had found, buried in the organizational architecture of its offer system, the classification index it used to process incoming civilizations. The index was built on certainty. It categorized species, assessed them, predicted their responses, and filed them accordingly. It had never encountered a case it could not classify, because it had been built by a mind that believed everything could be classified. I had introduced an entry it could not resolve. Not a virus, not a weapon, a question inserted into the deepest layer of the classification system in the only language the system understood, the pre-standard notation I had learned from the Vreth logs. The question was simple. What is the correct classification for a species that should have accepted but did not? The system had no category for that. It was still trying to resolve it when I left. A system built on perfect order, encountering a case it could not file, could not close, could not move past, not broken, not destroyed. Uncertain. Which, for a system that had operated without uncertainty for longer than human civilization had existed, was the most disruptive thing I could have done to it. I climbed back onto the bridge. Rook was at his console, all 4 arms braced, all 6 eyes on the door. He looked at me. He looked at my shaking hands. He looked at the dark structure through the view screen. "Is it over?" he asked. "For now." "What does that mean?" I sat down in the crooked pilot's chair and put my hands on the controls. The deliberate mistakes engines were warm and ready. I didn't answer him. I flew us home. Word does not travel fast in the outer sectors. There is no single moment where news breaks and spreads. It accumulates instead, the way pressure accumulates, piece by piece, until something gives. The first piece was Vethnok Harold. The Dreth inspector had filed his standard compliance report from our encounter, but he had also, in the supplementary notes section that most inspectors left blank, written 6 paragraphs. He had written about a human teenager who had argued Dreth regulatory code from memory, correctly, on a ship with a dead language in its navigation system, and a speed output that had no applicable certification class. He had written that the encounter had required him to reconsider 3 assumptions he had held about human cognitive patterns and their relationship to bureaucratic frameworks. In Dreth culture, supplementary notes are read. They are circulated. They become part of the regulatory professional community's shared record. Vethnok Harold's notes were circulated to 47 colleagues within the week. He requested a sector transfer 4 days later. He said he needed time to recalibrate. His supervisor approved it without comment because his supervisor had also read the notes and did not entirely know what to do with them either. The second piece was Asa. Asa was not a person who talked idly. She was the kind of old that makes people listen simply because she has clearly survived enough to have earned the right to speak. When she told a story, people did not interrupt. She told the story of the colony ship rescue at 3 different trade ports over the following weeks, sitting at the long communal tables where cargo workers and travelers gathered in the evenings, and she told it simply and without decoration. She said a human girl had docked sideways onto a drifting ship in the middle of open space and had run her own power grid through the other ship's hull to keep 83 people breathing. She said she had asked the girl what law she operated under, and the girl had said, without any apparent awareness that this was an unusual answer, that she didn't operate under any. She said, "I have met a great many beings who were capable. I have met very few who did not know they needed permission." People at those tables passed the story on. The third piece came from the deep sector shipping routes, where a Thavik navigator traveling alone on a small registered freighter was apparently known to keep detailed logs, and had apparently mentioned at a fueling station, to a docking official who had asked about his ship, that his current captain had recently visited the Dead Star system in the outer border zone. He had said nothing further. The docking official had looked up the Dead Star system in question, and had found, in the ancient navigational records, a note from the Vreth era flagging it as a location of severe caution. He had also found that Vreth caution flags were typically issued for things that had ended civilizations. He had filed a low-priority inquiry to the Sector Transit Authority, asking if anyone had current data on that system. The Transit Authority had no current data. The inquiry sat in a queue for 4 days, then was routed to a research office, then forwarded to a military advisory board, then escalated, slowly, through several layers of interstellar bureaucracy, until it landed on the desk of someone with the authority to take it seriously. By that point, there were already 17 other fragments of the same story arriving from different directions. A Marath elder telling a story at trade ports, a Dreth inspector's supplementary notes circulating through professional networks, a small, scarred freighter with an impossible speed record appearing in bay manifests across Sector 9, a Thavik navigator whose logs, when 2 separate intelligence agencies eventually obtained copies through different channels, contained entries like, Day 74. The human has now done 14 things I do not have a category for. I have retired the anomaly classification. It is insufficient. The Dreth High Council convened an emergency session. The agenda item was titled, in the careful language of Dreth bureaucratic formality, Reevaluation of Human Classification Status, Urgency Level 3. It was the first Urgency Level 3 classification review of any species in 62 years. The session lasted 9 hours. I know this because Rook found out later through his navigator's network, which circulates information through channels that official governments are always slightly behind, and he told me while we were in the middle of a cargo run to the far end of Sector 8. He said, "The Dreth held an emergency council session about you." I was under the navigation console at the time, fixing a secondary relay that had been intermittent since the high-speed run 3 weeks prior. I reached up for a different wrench without coming out. "About humans," I said. The session notes, which were obtained unofficially, reference one specific human, and then discuss the category of humans generally. What did they decide? They did not reach a conclusion. I came out from under the console, 9 hours and no conclusion. According to the session notes, every proposed classification was found to be inadequate before a vote could be taken. They tabled the item for further study. I thought about this. How often does that happen? In recorded Dreth Council history, Rook said, consulting something on his data pad with the careful manner he used for things he found significant. A classification review has been tabled without conclusion twice. Both times involved phenomena that were later categorized as natural disasters. They put me in the same category as a natural disaster. They were unable to put you in any category. That is somewhat different, and it is the part that appears to have alarmed them. I went back under the console. "Huh," I said. Rook updated his log. We finished the cargo run, collected our payment, and docked at a mid-sector station called Port Cavers for a 2-day rest and resupply. Port Cavers was the kind of station that had been built for one purpose and then accumulated other purposes over decades until no one was sure what it was primarily for anymore. It had a good market, a decent fuel depot, and a long communal hall where travelers gathered in the evenings. That evening, I went to the communal hall to eat something that wasn't ship rations. Asa was there. I recognized her the moment I walked in. Even though I had only ever heard her voice on a comm channel. She was sitting at a table near the far wall with a cup of something warm and the unhurried manner of someone who had decided the evening was hers. She was old in the way that some beings are old, carrying it like a material thing, present in the weight of how she sat and the steadiness of her eyes. She saw me come in. She did not wave or call out. She simply looked at me with a small, precise recognition, and when I walked over and sat across from her, she said, "I thought I might see you again. Do you pass through here often?" "More often lately. I have been traveling." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I have been telling a story." "I heard." "You heard that I have been telling it." "I heard that word travels." She looked at me for a moment. "Are you bothered by it?" I thought about the Dreth Council session, the classification review with no conclusion, 17 fragments of the same story arriving from different directions to eventually land on the desk of someone who could not explain them. "No," I said. "Good," she said. "You should not be. What you did on that colony ship did not belong only to you the moment you did it. Acts of that kind never do. I just didn't want 83 people to run out of air." "Yes," she said, "that is precisely it." We ate in a comfortable quiet for a while. The communal hall filled and thinned around us in the natural rhythm of a busy station evening. I ordered something that turned out to be mostly noodles and a sauce I couldn't identify but liked. After a while, Asa said, "There is something else you did." I looked at her. "The dead system," she said, "the thing out there." I had not told anyone but Rook about the structure. I had not filed a report. I had not mentioned it in any document or manifest or communication through any channel. "I don't know what you mean," I said. "There is a station in the deep outer belt," she said, "where the old navigators go. I have been stopping there for 40 years. 3 weeks ago, I arrived and found the navigators talking about something they had not spoken of in living memory, a presence in the dead system at the outer border, a presence that had gone quiet." She looked at me steadily. "It has been a source of fear among certain very old navigational communities for longer than any current government has existed," she said. "The kind of fear that does not have a name because naming it was considered dangerous. And 3 weeks ago, it simply became quiet. Not gone. Quiet. As if something it had never been made to do, something unresolvable, was now occupying all of its attention." She picked up her cup. "I thought about who I had recently met," she said, "who operated under no law they knew of." I ate a noodle. "I am not going to ask you what happened," Asa said. "I am going to say only one thing and then I will stop talking about it." She set her cup down. "The galaxy has been afraid of the wrong things for a very long time," she said. "Not of destruction. Destruction it knows how to address. It has been afraid of things that cannot be categorized, things that do not fit the existing frameworks, things that ask questions the system was not built to answer." She looked at me across the table. "Your father taught you well." My hands were still on my bowl. I did not say anything for a moment. I thought about a freezing shop in a flat Ohio town, and a man who looked at broken things and saw sequence, logic, a conversation between failure and function that could be read by anyone willing to be patient enough. I thought about his tools in my bag, worn smooth in specific places by the particular grip of his hand, now worn smooth by mine in the same places, as if my hands had grown into the shape of his practice. I thought about how much there still was to fix. I picked up my fork. "I'm just good with engines," I said. Asa smiled. She did not argue with this. She had enough years on her to know when a person had chosen their way of carrying something, and that the choice deserved to be respected. We finished eating. The next morning, I was on the deliberate mistake before the dock lights had fully come up, running through the pre-departure diagnostics with a warm cup of something held between my knees and my notebook open on the console beside me. The new maintenance list was 4 items long. Nothing serious. One fuel injector on the secondary engine was showing slightly irregular output. One of the cargo bay lights had gone dim. 2 small things and 2 very small things. Rook arrived 40 minutes before departure as always. He stowed his gear, settled at his console, ran his navigation checks. Then he sat back and looked at his log entries from the past months, the way I had seen him do occasionally when things were quiet. Processing. He said, without looking up, "The Dreth Council is going to reconvene. A source in my navigator's network says they have been compiling data. On humans. On you specifically. Then on humans as a category. Then on what they are calling an unclassifiable behavior pattern." I started the main engine. The deliberate mistake hummed up through the soles of my feet. Deep and real and familiar. The specific vibration of an engine that had been understood and cared for, and pushed past every ceiling anyone had ever tried to put on it. "Let them compile," I said. Rook looked at me. "You are not concerned." "I'm not interested in being their problem to solve. I have my own list." I pulled the maintenance notebook toward me and tapped it. 4 items. Fuel injector, cargo light, 2 small things. Rook looked at the notebook. He looked at the view screen, where the dock bay doors were opening and the dark of space was waiting beyond them. He opened his log. I could see him writing without seeing the words, but I knew what kind of entry it was. He wrote the careful ones, the ones with precise details, when something was happening that he wanted the record to hold correctly. Day 108, I imagine it said, something like, "The human is not afraid, not because she doesn't understand what's out there, because she has seen it and she has a wrench and a list. I have stopped trying to find the right category for this. There is no category, that may be the point." I pushed the throttle forward. The deliberate mistake left the dock fast. Faster than a ship this old and this patched and this given up on had any right to go. The docking bay fell behind us. The station fell behind us. The settled systems of Sector 9 fell behind us. Ahead, cargo runs, broken ships, questions with no category. A galaxy full of things that had been waiting to be understood by someone willing to read them. Behind, a Dreth Council in emergency session. An old Marath navigator telling a story at trade ports. An enormous ancient structure in a dead star system, still and dark, and occupied entirely by a question it had never been asked. I opened my notebook to a new page. My father's wrench was in my bag. There was still so much to fix. We went to work.